All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the October version of the Ability Grand Rounds for the Center for Excellence in Disabilities. We appreciate you joining us. Um, we are going to quickly go into the presentation, but I just want to remind everyone to make sure that you're on mute, to utilize the chat or raise your hand if you have questions along the way. We'd love your questions and your comments. And we'll make sure that we have time at the end for questions if all else fails. So the other thing is this will be recorded. Please use closed captioning. That is an option here if needed. And let us know if you have any technical issues along the way in the chat function. We'll be watching that. So today I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Jaeger from University of Maryland at College Park, not too far from here. He and his team are going to, or colleagues, I should say, because they've all dispersed and have works of their own as well. But for this project and others, they've connected, and that's really great for us to highlight. They're going to introduce themselves in more detail, so I'm going to quickly turn it over. But today we're talking about sustainable global cross-disability communities, which we all can relate to here in West Virginia. And without further ado, Dr. Jaeger, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, I'm actually going to step in for Paul here. My name's Sarah Olson. I'm a recent PhD graduate from University of Maryland and currently still teach there, but my day job is a disability rights program specialist for the Department of Justice, so enforcing ADA. I've got into disability rights and the disability communities through my work coming out of the military with wounded veterans. And I'll turn it over to Ron to introduce himself.
Hey all, my name is Ron Padrone, ACM pronouns. I'm the Director of Undergraduate Operations at the University of Maryland's College of Information Studies. I'm also a member of the President's Commission on Disability Issues and the co-chair of the President's Commission on LGBTQ+ issues. And I got involved with Including Disability, the summit for the last summit, so the 2021, and then have kept involved and then been part of the journal, which we'll talk about. And I originally came into it through my involvement with the President's Commission on Disability Issues, which I got involved with as somebody who developed a chronic disabling illness and was looking for community on campus and found that through PCDI.
Thanks, Ron. Natalina, would you mind introducing yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Natalina Tsangalova, and I'm a public health librarian here at the University of Maryland in College Park. And I know all my colleagues presenting today through the President's Commission on Disability Issues. I have been involved with the Commission for many years, and currently I'm the co-chair inheriting Paul Jaeger in that role.
Great, thank you, Natalina. And our fearless leader, Paul, will you please introduce yourself and kick us off?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today. I am Paul Jaeger. I'm a professor at the University of Maryland's College of Information Studies, and I co-direct the university's Museum Scholarship and Material Culture graduate program. I am a disability lifer, and so I've come to these issues pretty early on. And so, you know, what we're going to be talking about today are a conference and some accompanying things that we have built that has gotten very large and has been successful in building a community along the lines of the title of the talk. And so the context that everyone has mentioned is, you know, we're all part of a group that works on this conference and its accompanying journal. And before we get started, I just want to mention also that the fifth name on the presentation, Alex Peterson, was not able to join us today, unfortunately, but she's, I just, you know, got to mention she's a wonderful collaborator on all of these things, and we're sad she couldn't make it today. So to get into the actual talk, the idea here is to provide lessons we've learned from developing what started as a small but innovative conference and has grown into something very large, how we have done well and then also done not so well and learned and done better on different aspects of using events to bring people together with different disabilities, different fields, different professions, to build not only a dialogue of disability that is a large one, not siloed, but also bring people together to continue those engagements and interactions and collaborations beyond the events. So the Disability Summit is the thing we're talking about. It's now about 10 years old. I'm bad with math and time, but we have this every 2 years simply because it is so large and it's an all volunteer event. But the core fundamentals of what make it what it is it's specifically international. We encourage and welcome and are delighted to get participation from all over the world. It is intentionally cross-disciplinary. So we allow a space where people from all kinds of different disciplines can learn about disability work that's going on in fields they might never interact with. It's intentionally cross-disability. And in that, instead of so many venues focus on one type of disability, in the same way so many focus on disability from one field, we want to help people have the opportunity to learn the things that connect them across different kinds of disabilities. And those three pillars have actually led us to some really interesting, really neat discoveries as we've gone along. The conference is now also virtual. It originally started in person, but we have found that taking it virtual makes it so much more accessible for so many different kinds of people, not just to save them the cost of the trip to get here, but because when it's virtual, it can be much more accessible for all kinds of different disabilities that might present barriers otherwise for a physical conference. We've always made it free for attendees. When you're talking about making things accessible, that seems like a really important part of it. That puts extra work on organizers for fundraising, but it keeps it really open. And so what we've wound up with is a really robust global network of disabled people, advocates, educators, scholars, government officials, family members, allies, accomplices. It's a really neat, big community. And now Sarah's gonna talk some more about how it actually works.
Yeah, so thank you, Paul. As Paul mentioned, it began as this day-long in-person event run by 3 people. Our organizing committee has grown to over 10. It's now a 3-day virtual conference. And, there's this, he mentioned earlier, and Ron mentioned it as well, this need for more platforms. So Paul mentioned we do this every other year because it is quite a heavy lift for volunteers to do. So what happens in the interim? Well, what happens in the interim is this Including Disability Journal that takes the concepts of the Disability Summit, the cross-disciplinary, cross-disability, and puts it into a periodical that's released right now twice a year. So being an all-volunteer organization, the organizing actually becomes highly critical. Alex Peterson and Amanda Strausser were our sort of logistics committee chairs. And really what makes the summit work functionally was having, once the roles for the volunteers were identified, having very clear handbooks that we could send out to volunteers with, here's your expectation, here's, if it required additional training, here's when we were going to offer that, or additional meetings, here's links, here's who to ask questions. if you were a moderator, a script even, the expectation of having a few questions already prepared for whatever you were moderating, such that if there weren't questions in the chat immediately, that you could keep the conversation going. Guidelines and guidebooks for the presenters, the expectation of an image description, the expectation of very clear contrasting slides, providing slides early so that we could post them on the website for those that preferred to have slides to go along with the presentation. And if available, having a script early so that we could actually provide that to attendees as well. And one of the other changes that we've made over the last several iterations is having a very clear reviewer rubric. So the bigger this gets, the more submissions we have for panels, for presentations. And in order to take advantage of those previous presenters or other people within the various fields of actually doing the review for accepting presentations, we created a rubric and a standardized form for here's what the abstract looks like, here's what they've requested to present, in terms of timeline, panel, individual, that type of thing. And here's your rubric for it. And it made the entire process much, much easier, again, for an all volunteer organization. And as we talk about, expanding the summit and where it's come from and where it's going, Paul mentioned it started several years ago and was this one day event. It actually started 2016 in the basement of a library that had a power outage the day of the summit, so that to in 2019, we had 250 attendees. It was still in person at the time. 31% identified as having a disability. 20% identified as being a family member of somebody with a disability. And 33% were researchers or professionals within a disability field. There's a lot of positives from that 2019 feedback. The networking opportunities, the representation of disabled people as presenters, the ability to be able to ask questions and to see where people with disabilities were taking their research or their advocacy. There were negatives though too. The idea of the concurrent sessions, it was a single day, and in order to get everything to fit in, we had overlapping and competing sessions. And so attendees felt that they were restricted from actually being able to experience the full event because they had to pick and choose, or they had to leave one early to attend another. We also made, in my opinion, a critical error in some of our accessibility options. We provided CART, so live transcription, for our events, but we didn't have interpreters. So those deaf individuals within the audience couldn't actually participate in the Q&A. They could read what was being said during presentations, but that was it. Similarly, we did not have interpreters for the poster session. So you had deaf presenters who couldn't actually present their posters, nor could they answer questions from other attendees. So we took that information, and in 2021, between the pandemic and wanting to be as accessible to as many people as possible, we went entirely online. We moved from 1 to 3 days and removed all concurrent sessions. So you could still pick and choose if what you wanted to attend, but there were no competing sessions. Every session had both ASL interpreters and CART transcription. We had 872 registrants, and the max for any single day was 301. So we were able to work with 301 people at any given time. About the same in terms of 30% identified as professionals in the field, of researchers or other professionals. There were 48% that marked other, and that other comprised activists, people with disabilities, that was the reason they were attending. And we had 69% that were first-time attendees. Again, lots of great feedback. The slides were clear. The captions and the interpreters were easy to understand. There was some feedback on the links for the sessions because we had individual Zoom links for each one. were a little bit hard to find, or maybe not as easy to find as they would like. And what was missing was the networking. So I'd also be interested in anybody who's listening to this presentation today, if they have ideas on how to maximize networking in a virtual environment. We're currently fielding ideas for 2023. And our top sessions were one on self-advocacy and one on policing the disabled body. So I'll kick it back to Paul.
Thank you. So as we've talked about so far, and as Ron and Natalina will go into in a lot more detail in a bit, the key thing of when you're holding an event for disabled people is making sure every element of it is accessible. And you know, that's from the announcements to the registration, to the platforms of delivering the whole event, to the follow-up evaluations, to support during the event. But accessibility, we found, really is a very comprehensive thing that goes beyond the technological when you're thinking about a very large, multinational, multi-disability group. And one way we've refined in thinking about this ourselves in our situation, but it's also ideas that we think are pretty useful in thinking about disability beyond just sort of community sustenance, is thinking about it in terms of when you're working with a group of disabled people, there's both a disability tax and an accessibility tax to keep in mind. So you may be familiar with the idea of taxes, the emotional and economic extra weight on marginalized populations. So you may have heard of the pink tax, that or the black tax. When you're talking about disabled people, it's really two different kinds of these extra weights in parallel. So if you think about the disability tax that is affecting everybody who's participating in your event, that's the inherent discrimination that affects marginalized groups that is more familiar. So discrimination in hiring, promotion, retention, expectations of providing extra value, being the person who can't decline the extra labor, being always assumed to be the representative who can speak for, roughly being the Lorax for the population you're a part of. And so there's all of that. And with disability, there's also the element of everything has sort of assumptions of able-bodiedness built into it in most organizations. So the disability tax is a pretty comprehensive thing, but it has a companion when you're talking about disabled people and the extra weight that society puts. And so with the accessibility tax, it's keeping in mind all of the extra technologies or interfaces that require time to learn, effort to use, money to purchase. So there's extra labor, extra financial cost simply to achieve accessibility. And so you can build as much accessibility into your community, into your event as possible, but you're still going to have people who are part of it who are relying on assistive technologies through their own machines. And so thinking about how do we support emotionally and literally technologically the people who are going to our events while using extra hardware or having the delays and the extra effort to keep them to keep their machines engaged with everything that's going on. And so when you think about accessibility tax, these things might include ensuring effective accommodations, navigating built barriers physically or technologically. And then this may not come into play with your community or your event, but it might. But the extra documentation and disclosure that's tied to accessibility that no other group has to deal with. So we learned, and we started to articulate these things through working with the summit and learning from it and trying to get better at it. And so you can see, we actually wrote a whole article trying to explain these things. But we really believe that thinking about both of these kinds of taxes are pretty much essential when you think about making an event, a community, or an organization truly inclusive.
Sorry, that's me. Just couldn't find the unmute button. So we're going to bounce around a little bit between myself and Adelina, I believe, talking about more of a deep dive into how the summit works, how we pulled it off, all the nuts and bolts that went into it. So I'm going to start off by talking about advertising. So as you saw in a previous slide, the last summit, this virtual summit, was so far beyond what the previous summits had been as far as reach and scope. We had almost 1,000 attendees from 15 countries. You also noticed in some of the stats that Sarah provided that only about 30% of the folks who attended identified as scholars or researchers. A lot of the folks, I think it was almost 40% of the people who attended were attending because they are somebody who identified as having a disability, and 69% of them were folks who this was their first time ever attending the summit. And a lot of this was really intentional because the way that we approached the summit and the way that we approached the journal, which we'll also talk about towards the end, is really with a focus on community and community building. And so it's not meant to be this sort of circular conversation happening within the ivory tower sort of thing. It's really supposed to be a community conversation, bringing people together to learn from each other's experiences, to hear about each other's experiences. Yes, there's definitely parts of it that are research-based or best practices-based, but there are also a lot of parts that are conversations or presentations or sessions around lived experience or shared experiences. So part of the way that we advertise this is we have a listserv, which includes past registrants. So if you've registered for the conference, then hopefully you stay on this listserv, as well as presenters. It has about 1,200-ish members so far. A note real quick is we are going to be sending out a call for proposals for the 2023 summit. So if you would like to register for this listserv, you could do so at the address that you see there. Also, the link that was dropped in chat takes you to the website, and at the bottom of the website for the Including Disability Global Summit, this address is also there as well. So you can also find it there. We also utilized our existing networks. And so we mentioned that many of us are associated with the President's Commission on Disability Issues at University of Maryland College Park. So we utilized that as a way of getting information about the summit, whether it was call for proposals or just the registration, out amongst our various networks, whether they're professional or community networks. And we also utilized various UMD disability student communities and resources, because we really also wanted to make sure that students were engaged in the summit, either as attendees or as presenters. We had, we'll talk a little bit about how we kind of structured the summit, and the different sessions were thematic as we kind of realized some themes that were coming out. But there was a session that was students presenting. So we had undergraduate students, and we also had graduate students. And we also, I think this was sort of the first foray into trying to use social media for this. And so we used our Twitter, which is the UMD Disability S1. We're currently exploring rebranding. But we use that to kind of start to build a following and a presence that we then heavily relied on during the actual summit itself.
Okay, so in order to continue building a stronger and more inclusive research and educational community for people with disabilities, we need we needed additional resources to take our vision and make it a reality. And as Paul mentioned, our biggest priorities are to ensure the summit is affordable and accessible for all. The total cost for the event, including accessible web platforms, recording and captioning for moderated conference and networking sessions, interpreters and digital support for deaf, hard of hearing, and blind or low vision attendees, was $40,000. We didn't spend it all, which is a good sign, but we had to reach out to various departments at the University of Maryland, sending them personal emails. This way, we established a relationship with these individuals, and we continually contact them for every summit to solicit fundraisers. And we developed 5 levels of sponsorship to accommodate any department budget. And we also applied for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion grant, and also a Pepsi grant is available at our campus. And as I already mentioned earlier, our outreach to potential sponsors emphasize summit priorities, which are the event to be fully accessible and free to attendees. And Ron already mentioned in the previous slide, we use the advertising networks to solicit sponsors as well. Next slide.
All right, so registration for the conference or for the summit was done through Google Forms, so that way that we could export things to Google Sheets for us to kind of manipulate as needed. And as we receive registrants, they were added to the email list to receive updates, and also so that way they can be included on future outreach about future summits in the journal, and anything else that we might be doing or think that would be of interest to this population. The registration form itself specifically asks for names, pronouns, and email address. It asks for the institutional organization, affiliation, and department, so that way we could kind of track some data and figure out where attendees are coming from, what disciplines. This was mostly just for us to kind of then parse through things at the back end and see how far our reach was and if there were specific groups that we were noticing. We also asked how folks heard about the summit. This is something that helps to inform how we advertise and how we outreach in the future, and it's definitely informing conversations now about how we will advertise and outreach for the 2023 summit. Whether they require a sign language interpreter, and then any additional access needs that they might have that we may not be thinking of, so that way we can incorporate those into the discussion and see how we can make those accommodations possible. Indicating if they're interested in attending a specific session. So if folks could just say they wanted to attend the whole thing. Folks could just say that they were only interested in attending the keynotes or other sessions. This helped to give us sort of a vague-ish sense of expected attendees for the different sessions. So that way, when we were recruiting volunteers to help manage everything, we kind of had a sense of how many sort of virtual bodies were going to be in the room, and that if we were limited on how many volunteers we had for a specific session, we could allocate accordingly. And then if they were interested in volunteering for the summit, so we mentioned that the coordinating committee is about 10 people, but on top of that, we had dozens of volunteers, some of them students, some of them professionals in the field, some of them friends and family that we roped in to help make this happen. The behind the scenes part of this was an incredible lift, both leading up to the summit and then during the actual 3 days of the summit, just making sure that we were responding to any accessibility needs or any concerns that were happening in real time. Next slide. Speaking about real time, so we've mentioned a few times that one of the things that we couldn't replicate in sort of this virtual space were the organic networking opportunities that occurred. So we experimented with ways to kind of make it seem like it was, make it really feel like it was an event that was happening in real time. One of the ways that we did this was live tweeting the summit. So we had pre-made templates that highlighted the upcoming speakers, lectures, sessions, all of these things that we scheduled them to go out about 10-15 minutes before each session or each speaker. So that way if folks were following, that they could remember to attend the summit, but also we didn't lock registration once the summit started. So that way, if somebody happened to just come across through the use of the hashtags, or if they had just started following us, it had a link for them to be able to register, and we were monitoring that in real time to make sure that as new registrants are happening during the course of the summit, that they would be added to the list. So that way they would get the Zoom links and the reminders that we're going out. We also, myself, Stephanie Cork, and another volunteer were sitting in on sessions and live tweeting quotes and reactions based off of what we were seeing in the Zoom chat, or based off of what the speakers were presenting about. We're also live tweeting links to resources provided by the presenters. This was really helpful for us to have in advance if there was a script or the presentations, so that way we could have things queued up, so that way as presenters were talking about different resources, we could link them out. And I mentioned before that the social media was managed by multiple volunteers. We also wanted to make sure that the Q&A components of any sessions ran as smoothly as possible. And so we had two volunteers who are helping to manage the Q&A component to make sure it was as real-time and smooth as possible. So the moderator who was facilitating any particular session had access to a Google Doc where a volunteer was sitting in there and pulling questions that were appearing in chat. During the course of the presentations, we would ask people to drop their questions in chat and let them know that they would be compiled, and then the moderator to ask the questions during the Q&A component. So we were able to pull those questions, and then given limited time that we had for Q&A, the volunteer could prioritize certain questions or notice themes that were coming up and select a representative question to address that topic. And they would elevate those to the top of the Google Doc. We usually put them in bold, so that way the moderator didn't have to go hunting for questions to ask. They were all there, and as they were asked, and we would strike them through, so the moderator could go to the next one. Next slide.
So we tapped on the existing resources and worked with the campus accessibility and disability service to provide live captioning, ASL interpreters, and CDI for keynote speaker presentations. It was really convenient to work with this department, so we didn't have to tap and look for any external resources and services. For pre-recorded videos and recorded presentations, we use Panopto software to request and provide closed captions. These videos were shared with the registrants after the summit. Next slide, please. As we gained more and more experience with Zoom during the pandemic, we use Zoom for all live presentations. We identified the experts among us, as well as volunteers, to moderate the sessions via Zoom. The recorded videos were uploaded in YouTube after being closed captioned in Panopto. We had several people from our committee who sent out, as Ron mentioned, to send out tweets at various times before, during, and after the summit. We had multiple modes of delivery to accommodate different abilities to process information, as you see listed in this on this slide: pre-recorded presentations with live QAs, live lectures, interactive workshops, PDF and plain text event programs, and also copies of PowerPoint presentations, of course, with the presenter approval. In terms of accessible technology, we had the live captioning provided as a link where people could access on a separate screen and adjust the font size. And also we provided the automated closed captions provided through the Zoom platform. And we also provided American Sign Language interpreter. We had a dry testing with the interpreters to make sure the light, the background, the positions of the interpreter on the screen is appropriate and clearly visible without any distractions. Next slide, please.
All right, and then as Sarah mentioned at the beginning, the summit is every 2 years. And so there was a conversation about how do we keep this going in between. We got a lot of really positive feedback, during the summit itself as responses to Twitter, and then in sort of the survey that we did afterwards. And there was a lot of momentum of we wanted to keep that momentum. We were like, how, do we batted around a lot of ideas of, do we do sort of small workshops, something that's like a scaled down version of the summit that's maybe just a one day or one afternoon in the off years. Ultimately, what we landed on was creating a journal. So the journal is called Including Disability. And it kind of keeps the same ethos as the summit, which is that it is not meant to be this sort of high academic sort of platform. It is a space to elevate disabled voices and to continue the conversation around disability and accessibility, and in a way that is community oriented and community based. And so we definitely do have, we have one issue out so far. The next issue is coming out by the end of the year. The first issue includes essay versions of our 2 keynote speeches, as well as the disability accessibility tax that paper that Paul mentioned. And I believe there's another thing in there that I'm blanking on right now. And the second one is the theme of that is called Naming Disability. And it's a conversation around people's relationship to how they name their disabilities, or how they name being identified as as a disabled person. A lot of that conversation around disability, or person first language. So the purpose of the journal is to keep a community oriented and a community led conversation happening in between the summits. The goal right now is to have 2 issues a year. We have sort of themes planned out, but obviously as things in the world happen, we'll try to respond to those as well. I guess I will put a pitch out there that we're always looking for submissions. We're always looking for reviewers. And so if this is something that you're interested in getting involved with, feel free to reach out to us. You can find information, including Disability Journal link. Yeah, and then I think that is it. So that is our presentation, and we made good time, which is notable for us. And I guess we can turn it over for questions now.
Ooh.
So many questions, it's hard to think where to start.
It looks like Eric has his hand up.
I did. I was trying to find my little marker thing. So, hello. I was wondering, in regards to creating this environment of unconditional positive regard, something that you could create, support this community. Was there any conversation about that, the system versus me, and that feeling of alienation? The mental health aspect of it is what I'm wondering. Was there a lot of conversation about that?
I've been involved since 2019, and I don't think it's been an explicit part of our conversations about the summit. However, there were several submissions and themed panels associated with that in our last one. But that's I think a great conversation to have, and just not one we've addressed yet that I recall. Paul, I don't know if you and Stephanie had conversations like that early on.
Yeah, so we did in the first couple, a lot of the work as we tried to set it up was figuring out how to, even though, those were the in-person ones, so there the focus really was on maximizing accessibility and welcomingness to all aspects of disability. So yes, initially we really did try to think through how can we present things so that people from all different kinds of disabilities, whether as a researcher, an educator, or a member or a family member, could feel supported and contribute to the event with their research or perspectives. And so from the beginning, we've had a really wide range of disabilities represented. So yeah, it was part of establishing the ethos of it, was trying to figure out how do we use language to make it clear that all groups are welcomed from within disability.
And Paul, if I can piggyback off of that, I think part of the way we do it is sort of how we live as organizers and support each other's, you know, keeping in mind what we want the summit to be. I think we are also kind to each other from a mental health perspective. And by doing that, it comes across in how we interact and what's expected, you know, within attendees, presenters, that type of thing, that, you know, mistakes are okay and nothing's anybody's fault. And it's about bringing the community together, regardless of what, you know, it ends up looking like. And I think having that mentality and sort of true belief internally comes across in the way we present ourselves, or at least I hope it does.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Melina, did you have your hand up too? Or was that just you?
I did. I have a lot of logistical questions. So and I see you laughing, Ron, because I'm sure that it's difficult, especially with only 10 of you. So I heard you guys mention Zoom. Was there a specific platform or software package that you had to get that would accommodate over 1,000 people? And then also, I guess, how did you work out the accessibility components for the presenters that would be delivering? Did you guys have teams that would work on that as a part of your committee, or did you provide guidelines to the presenters and the expectation was that their materials would all be accessible?
So I can start answering the question and then kind of pass it off to other folks. And so as far as purchasing stuff, we paid for, you know, cart and ASL and stuff like that, but for the Zoom platform itself, we just used University of Maryland Zoom license. The Zoom seminar rooms that are incorporated with our license have a fairly high attendee cap. So that was just something that we were able to utilize off the bat. As far as the other question, I know we did ask for, and I'll pass it over to, I think, Sarah and Adelina. I think they might know this a little bit better, but we definitely did provide guidelines for how we, you know, would like things to be submitted, so that way it was easier on our volunteers and our team. But I think Natalina and Sarah could answer that better.
I'm actually going to give it to Natalina because she was really the powerhouse behind any print or downloadable material that was accessible.
Yeah, whenever whenever I receive any of the documentations and the slides, I try to run the accessibility checks and communicate it with the presenters whenever there were some issues, but in the majority they were pretty mindful of the conference that materials should have been made accessible anyway. So there was accessibility check running through the materials to make sure they are really accessible to everyone.
Okay, and one more question. I'm sorry. How far out do you guys begin planning for your next one? Because I know it's every 2 years. So are you eat, sleep, and breathe the whole time, or do you allow yourself some downtime and then hit it hard?
I mean, the day after it's done. We definitely have a debrief afterwards. I think we had a debrief like not too long after it ended. We were all taking sort of contemporaneous notes as what was working, what wasn't working, our thoughts. And we met and had a debrief after and kind of said, here's what went well, here's what we need to do in the immediate aftermath of it, especially like getting the recorded videos transcribed so we can get those out, stuff like that. So there was some post-summit admin that needed to happen. But then, Sarah, when would you say that we started up, like really planning?
So one of the things we did post the last summit was create the handbook that actually had a nominal timeline. And so the timeline starts about 18 months out. It starts to get kind of really picks up, 6 to 8 months out, but we're looking to, capture theme ideas early on, start to send out save the dates, that type of thing. So the planning and thinking about what the next one looks like starts very late, about 18 months out, and starts to get pretty heavy about 10 months out.
Another thing that we are planning, because you see the new website is not up and running yet. This is another person that we had to take into consideration. Some of the organizing committee left the university and they don't have access to our web servers. So we had to figure out how to provide better access to everyone in the committee because, life thing happens and people come and go. So right now we have few websites and we are trying to transfer all the content to the new website right now.
So since COVID, you all mentioned a silver lining that we've all broadened our horizon. We had every other year, we go back to back between our TBI and West Virginia Disability Conference. So something very similar. And it's around the time that you all are doing this, April, but now international is becoming our backyard, right? As you've mentioned. So my question relates to, and it kind of speaks to before we let everyone in, where do you see this going? Do you think if we're all going international that we start collaborating on disability related and our communities get bigger? And if so, how do we do that? Does your group of 10 become 20 because you've added people, or do we still connect but keep independent? What do you think?
I'm going to nominate Paul to answer this question because I think he has some no pun intended vision for where this is going.
Well, for one thing, one of the things that we've been really happy about our ability to bring people together across so many different disciplines and disabilities has been the new research that people form on their own through connections they make at the summit. And so there's lots of that kind of collaboration that becomes feasible because of technology. So the bits of fusion to create new perspectives on disability across disciplines or disabilities is one thing that is, a spin-off from the summit that we don't have a hand in. That is a really neat one of the things where the summit can create new things going forward. As far as the summit itself and the journal, yeah, we definitely hope to keep expanding. This Sarah mentioned early on, that we had people presenting from 15 different countries. That kind of level of interaction is just amazing. Especially we had, when you consider what some of the things covered, we had someone from Eastern Europe talking about how they're reforming their social services in the government to expand services specifically for people with disabilities in the country of Georgia. A little later that same day, we had someone presenting from a country in Southeast Asia talking about voter drives to increase participation of disabled people in voting in their country. And so the more voices from the more different places we hear, not only do we learn more about the different problems and the commonalities, but we have an opportunity to influence by what people learn, what's going on in so many different places, by people being from all these different places and walking away with, hey, let's try that, or we never thought of that. So, you know, the alchemy aspect that we've always emphasized of bringing so many different perspectives together is really helped along by the big increase in people from all over the world wanting to be involved in events virtually. So yeah, this is for us, this really is a great opportunity going forward to keep expanding the voices from the different places in this. And if that leads to more collaborations with other groups, you know, on our part, that's fantastic too.
No, that's true. I mean, it is a small world when you get on here and you hear similarities and even differences, but then you start looking at the culture, surrounding culture. And I know several of us have had those conversations. Many of us are on here of where disability intersects with race, with community, with other aspects of culture, other parts of our identity. And so I'd be curious to see, and hopefully we could submit some things to your summit. Any other questions or comments? And Teresa, thank you for including the platform piece. Did you want to say anything to that, or are you all familiar with GatherTown? I'm not.
GatherTown is, I was first introduced to it through science fiction conventions. Because I'm a big nerd and I go to those things. And it's built as a 16-bit video game interface. I don't know about how accessible it is for those maybe with vision impairments, but it does, you have these little 16-bit characters that you can personalize a little bit, but then they travel around this virtual environment. And when you get close to someone else, then video things pop up and you can join in a conversation with a person or a group of people, just like you would in a convention or in, you know, at a conference. You can go to rooms and be put into a specific Zoom room for that particular kind of like panel kind of thing. So it would certainly be something to look at if you're still looking to increase that networking, because it would provide through the little 16-bit characters that kind of sense of being in the same place with them and able to interact with anybody who happens to be on the screen. But you definitely would have to check into it about how accessible it is or can be made, because I just don't know anything about that.
I'm looking at it right now, and Teresa, this is awesome looking. It is that 16-bit. I mean, this is hilarious. But I see when you pop up next to somebody, a screen pops up like we're looking at each other right now. That is really creative.
Nice. Well, thank you. Check it out and use it. Any other questions or comments? Well, we really appreciate you guys taking the time to, oh, sorry.
Well, Leslie, I just wanted to circle back to something you said before the last comment about that platform. Ron did mention this earlier, but please do, if you're interested, we'd love to have submissions for the next summit. We'd love to see papers for the journal. We really do want these to be welcoming and inclusive of everybody's voices and interests. So, you know, the mention was made of intersectionality. We've had a lot of stuff at the summit on intersectionality in some really amazing and creative ways. So, you know, if that is part of your work, we certainly would be happy to see it. But, you know, we really want these to be places where people can feel like they can contribute. So please consider it with your own work. Thank you.
No, thank you. We will definitely. So those are in the chat, the links, and then they're also embedded in the slides. And if you all are okay with that, we'll circulate the slides as well so that they could have those links, because there were other important links too. That's okay. Okay. But thank you all very much. We've learned a lot from you today. We know it's a lot of work. And thanks for joining our little piece of national network. So everyone have a great day, and talk to you later. Thank you.